Have you been affected by the sequester? Not yet, perhaps, but the risk is uncomfortably high that you will be seriously affected. I'll talk with the Chief Federal Public Defender for the Northern District of West Virginia right now on the Law Works.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.
Closed captioning for the Law Works is made possible by a grant from the Monongalia County Bar Association to support legal information and education for all West Virginians. The Law Works is made possible by major grants from the Office of the West Virginia Attorney General and from Software Systems Incorporated, a West Virginia company established in 1975 which provides high-end support services, programming, and consulting for county government AS400 mid-range computer systems, as well as PC-based systems, and by a grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia.
The sequester is seriously affecting the functioning of the federal courts. My guest is the Chief Federal Public Defender for the Northern District of West Virginia, Attorney Brian Kornbrath. Brian, welcome back.
Thank you, Dan.
Why is it so important when we talk about the sequester that we would bring in a federal public defender to talk about it?
Well, we have a federal public defender office here in the Northern District of West Virginia, as well as every other state across the country. And federal public defender offices are responsible for defending those individuals who can't afford private counsel. So on a daily basis, we're handling the criminal cases, trying to protect the Fourth, Fifth, and Sixth Amendment constitutional rights that come up in almost every criminal case.
But more importantly, how you are able to do your job depends on how you are funded.
Definitely. Defender offices are provided an annual allocation. You have one budget that has to last you one fiscal year. And as anyone who has watched the news has learned, Congress has cut federal funding across the board, sequestration, and that's trickled down to almost every federal agency, including federal defender offices. So we are experiencing the most serious cuts that we've ever felt before.
Gee, times are tough for everybody. People are always being laid off from their jobs.
Sure.
People get fired. They have less money to spend on whatever it is they may want to spend it or need to spend it on. Why would you be any different? Why is it important that it affects you too?
Well, I'm not saying we're special or we should be treated differently, but at least in the private sector, if production falls off, if demand falls off, it makes good business sense perhaps to lay off workers and take them back when demand rises. At the federal level, when it comes to defending criminal cases, there's been no fall off. It's been increasing every year, and we're being asked to handle more with less.
In fact, I saw some statistics that said that from 2010 to 2013, the number of federal criminal cases that were filed increased by 62%.
Sure, I'm not doubting that. Civil cases have also either remained the same or gone up. I think the only area where it's gone down a bit might be bankruptcy, but it's still very busy in that area.
Of course, the court loads, state and federal courts across the nation have been increasing. People are either more litigious or in difficult economic times have more problems.
Right.
But that happens in criminal law also. The difference, though, between a bankruptcy action and a civil case or a divorce case is in a criminal case, you have a you as the accused have a constitutionally protected right to have an attorney, to have your case move forward and quickly.
Yes. There's also what's called a speedy trial right. You have a set period of time between your first appearance in court and finally disposing of your case. The purpose is so that if you're not able to make a bond and be released while the case is pending, you're not forced to stay in pretrial detention for lengthy periods of time.
Well, yeah, and that's important because the accused in a federal criminal case may be incarcerated or
Yes.
held in custody.
Right.
Or they may be on pretrial release, but pretrial release is a very strictly monitored period where the accused has to go to see a probation officer. Now, they call them probation officers. They're functioning as pretrial release officers in that case. They're not really on probation. And the word is out in the community, so they become essentially pariahs in their hometown, and they can't get jobs, can't keep jobs, and can't go out in public without being singled out and sometimes harassed.
I agree. So you have a speedy trial right, you have a caseload that hasn't decreased, but at least in my office, I've been forced to cut back on litigation expenses as well as furlough or let people go for up to 15 days without pay. And it's going to happen this fiscal year through October 1st and perhaps next year as well.
You, in fact, have been taking days off.
Yes.
Been furloughed.
I have the best grass in my neighborhood because I take each Friday off and cut my lawn.
Well, and it's not fair to say that you take each Friday off.
Right.
You are prohibited from going to work to do your job, and of course you're not paid for it because you're not there doing the job.
No, and you're being asked to perform 100% of the work in 80% of the time. That's not going to last forever, hopefully, but it's causing difficulty as we speak.
Well, it's not going to last forever, hopefully, but what's the outlook for next year?
Fiscal year 2014 is dim, and that's going to apply not only to federal public defender offices, but are what are also called panel attorneys. And of course, I'm sure you're familiar with that because you are a panel attorney.
That's right. The Criminal Justice Act panel provides for private practice attorneys to provide representation as a court-appointed attorney in some federal criminal cases, basically the ones that your office can't handle for one reason or another.
Yes, there's about 50 lawyers here in the Northern District of West Virginia, private lawyers who specialize in federal criminal defense, and they're paid an hourly rate by the government, as well as expenses. That's important. You, Dan, if you need an investigator or an expert, can ask for those expenses from the federal judges, and for the most part, you'll get them. So it's a very well thought out system that's going to be in jeopardy for the panel attorneys as well.
And I can, as a private CJA panel attorney, I can ask for the court to approve the expenses for an investigator or a counselor or for testing of some sort, mental health testing, for example. And the judge can approve it or can talk about whether it's really necessary. I talked with one judge just recently and asked if he had had occasion to deny a request for an expert or an investigator. He said he had not yet.
Correct. This year, it's going to be delays rather than refusal. Attorneys, investigators, expert witnesses will not get paid for at least 3 weeks in a row, so that the monies can be taken out of next fiscal year. So that means everyone basically is going to have to wait before they get their payments.
So the attorneys in your office are going to be furloughed for how many days?
At least 15 days.
At least 15 days. Criminal Justice Act attorneys and the people they hire are going to be delayed in receiving their payment.
For at least 3 weeks, right.
Well, what does the bank that handles your mortgage have to say when you say, well, I just lost a half a month's income?
Well, it's not as difficult for the attorneys, but I do have, single parent administrative staff who are having trouble making ends meet. And that's no different than any other federal employee across the country that's dealing with it. So it's not easy.
And members of the military are being similarly affected.
Right. And there's been certain federal employees that received dispensation. I think the FAA received additional funding so that we don't have the airport delays. Meat inspectors were put back on the job because we certainly don't want to go without our burgers for lengthy periods of time. But
well, I think they would characterize it as going without safe food for a period of time.
It's true.
And the FAA air traffic controllers and other employees, well, that seemed to be related more to congressmen not being able to catch their flights when they wanted to.
Correct.
So they fixed that.
Right.
With as many of them as are accused of criminal acts, though, you would think they would be concerned about seeing that the defense attorneys are paid.
It's important because it's a system. It requires everyone to be actively involved in the system, and that means prosecutors, judges, probation officers, clerks. In order for the system to operate smoothly, everyone has to be at their best. And if certain court units are being hindered by sequestration, it just affects the entire system, sure.
We're talking about the sequester and federal courts. My guest is the Chief Federal Public Defender of the Northern District of West Virginia, Attorney Brian Kornbrath. I'm Dan Ringer, and this is The Law Works. It becomes a pretty serious distraction to be told you can't do your job 20% of the time, or you're not going to be paid for weeks on end. And, well, one of the most common causes of divorce, for example, is money issues.
Sure.
The pressures are just huge. So you're trying to ensure that somebody's constitutional rights are upheld, enforced, and at the same time, you're worried about making ends meet.
Right, as are the attorneys that make up the panel. Like I said, there's about 50 attorneys here in the Northern District of West Virginia that handle the cases. They have office overhead. They have commitments as well. To go at least 3 weeks without getting paid matters. There's talk, it's not been firmly established, but there's talk that next fiscal year the attorneys are going to have a percentage of their payments reduced up front. And as a private practitioner, I'm sure that matters to you.
Well, it's the same as saying we're going to cut your hourly rate, whether
Right.
it's 10% or 15% or 5%, it's a reduction. And let's talk nitty gritty here. One of the things that happens when you're in private practice is that you have bills to pay. You have office rent, you have staff expenses, you've got to pay for your mortgage, you got to pay for your car or whatever else it is you're buying. You got bills. And somebody comes in and says, here, you have to do this work, but you're not going to be paid for a period of weeks. Now you've got a conflict of interest. The conflict is you've got other work to do that perhaps pays better, but at least pays on time. Which work are you going to do? Which work are you interested in doing most? The work that you're not going to get paid for weeks or months, or the work that's going to pay you promptly. And that's not fair. It's not fair to the accused person in the criminal case, because they deserve to have an attorney who's paying full attention to them instead of worrying about how to buy beans and rice to keep her or his family fed.
Correct. At the federal level, it's my understanding that a private attorney on the panel is paid $125 for their time.
Per hour.
Right, plus expenses. If it's a death penalty or capital case, I think it's $178 an hour. So that private attorney is getting paid for every hour put into the case, mileage to go back and forth to court or meet with clients. And then we talked about approaching the judges to get payment for expert witnesses, investigators, transcripts, other costs associated with the case. So, you have an attorney out there who's trying to do the best he or she can in a very specialized area of the law. And if the budget crisis requires you to just start cutting back on payment to these attorneys, some perhaps are going to say, I just can't keep handling these cases. Or they might say, I've got to put this case on the back burner and deal with the more lucrative case short term. And that's going to affect the system.
Yeah, it's at the risk of this sounding like a program of a couple of lawyers griping about money.
Right.
That's not the intent. Yes, $125 an hour, for example, which is what the panel attorneys are paid. That's not what you're paid as a public defender.
No, that's true. I'm paid an annual salary to defend federal criminal cases.
Right, and I'll tell you, it's a lot less than $125 an hour.
Sure.
But your office is paid for.
Right.
And that's the big difference. A private practice attorney can easily spend half or more of that hourly rate on staff, on electricity, utilities, on office rent, things of that sort, so that while it sounds like a lot of money in one way, it's not a lot of money in another way. There are lots of people in the world who make $30 or $40 an hour,
right,
who do not have to adhere to federal court schedules, which is brutal. There are a number of attorneys, particularly private practice attorneys, who want to have nothing to do with federal criminal court work because it is difficult.
It's difficult, it's complicated. The nature of the practice is that if you have a client who's being detained while the case is pending, you're traveling great distances to detention centers for meetings and interviews and meetings with probation officers, et cetera. So between going back and forth to court, to the detention centers, it takes its toll.
And some of these cases are huge cases. I was involved in one, within the last 6 months, where there were 24 defendants in the case. The amount of paper and other documents that are generated in cases like that is astronomical. In that particular case, I had almost 100 CDs and DVDs full of video recordings, audio recordings, and scanned documents.
Right.
And to triage all of that to find out how your client is affected takes, well, I want to say hundreds of hours. I don't remember if it was hundreds or dozens, but it takes a lot of time. And the courts have to pay for that.
And you had one defendant in a multi-defendant case, close to 20 defendants?
24 defendants,
All right.
by actual count.
So that means if our office is involved in that charging document, that indictment, we can take but one defendant. And since we can't represent the other 23, there's 23 lawyers like yourself who are each doing the same thing. And if it is a complicated case with tremendous amounts of discovery materials, CD-ROMs, audio tapes to listen to, what you're doing is multiplied by 23, and it adds up.
So some of you are thinking, well, these people are criminals. You don't have to do all of that for them. Well, they're not criminals. They're not criminals until the judge says you're guilty or the jury comes back and says, we find that you're guilty. Up until that point, you are at least a resident of the United States, typically a citizen of the United States with your rights intact. You may recall that the mantra is you're innocent until found guilty. We take that seriously. That doesn't necessarily mean that everybody believes a particular defendant is indeed innocent, because at some point culpability becomes apparent.
Oh, definitely. We've been open for 10 years now, and as a morale booster in our office, we actually have what's called the Wall of Fame. It's just a billboard where you post your dismissal orders. So if you go to trial and you have a client found not guilty, or you get the case dismissed, you put the court order up on the Wall of Fame. There's dozens up there. So
That's right.
after 10 years, you know, you're not winning every case, but you're making a difference.
We're talking about the sequester in the federal courts. My guest is the Chief Public Defender for the Northern District of West Virginia, Attorney Brian Kornbrath. I'm Dan Ringer, and this is The Law Works. Well, at least though we can say the playing field is even. The prosecutors and the defense are playing on equal footing.
That was Congress's desire, to have a system where both sides have equal funding, because federal public defenders and private attorneys who represent the defendants are up against the best of the best federal prosecutors, FBI, DEA, ATF, immigration, Secret Service, and experienced prosecutors. So if you want to defend the case, you need the funding to do so.
How much furlough time are the United States attorneys in this district getting?
This year, no furlough days, but there's a reason for that. The Attorney General of the United States, Eric Holder, requested and received permission from Congress to reallocate hundreds of millions of dollars that were in other accounts. And that means that there'll be no furloughs this year. But unless things change, my problems will be the problems that law enforcement and federal prosecutors have to deal with next year. They'll be subject to furloughs and layoffs as well.
So next year, 2014, fiscal year 2014, they'll face the same problems.
Right, which will begin this October.
But right now, you have 80% of the time to prepare a case that the prosecution has 100% of their time to prepare.
That's the short-term reality, yes.
That doesn't sound fair, Brian.
No, but we're hopeful that Congress will evaluate the situation and put us back on that even playing field.
Well, you're a federal employee. You can say hopeful.
Right.
I'm not a federal employee, and I'll tell you, I'm very much concerned that that's not going to happen.
No.
The reports that I have seen from federal judges in particularly important positions, such as the Chief Justice of the United States, John Roberts, are all saying the same thing, that this is unprecedented, it is untenable, the courts cannot continue to function like this. And by the way, the reason the Public Defender's Office does not get the benefit of this reallocation is that the prosecution and the Department of Justice works for the executive branch of the government.
Correct.
You work for the judicial branch of the government.
Yes, different branches.
So Mr. Holder can make reallocations to help out the police, the prosecutors, their investigators and experts. That doesn't affect you at all.
No. I mean, again, there's three branches of government: legislature, executive, judicial. The entire judicial budget across the board is maybe 3% of the national budget. So out of the three branches of government, it doesn't take an extreme amount of funding for the judicial branch, which is, judges, courts, probation officers, federal defender employees, members in the clerk's office. But the numbers are not going down. The work is not going down, but the monies to handle the cases is going down.
What's the morale like among public defenders across the nation?
Across the nation, it's the worst it's been for some time. There's at least 2 federal public defenders who retired early just so that their salary and benefits could go back into the office to lessen the dilemma for the other employees. Some defender offices have had to lay off people, attorneys, investigators, paralegals, staff members. And that's in order to reduce the furlough days to 15 days. So there's been serious layoffs across the country, and there's still furloughs that they have to deal with. So, our office has not yet had to lay off people. We only have 14 people total in our office, but you get one of the larger border state offices that handle hundreds, if not thousands, of immigration cases a year. You have an office that has hundreds of attorneys and staff on board.
Well, and there has been here in West Virginia, both the Northern and Southern District, a tremendous push on prosecuting drug crime.
Right.
And that's true nationally. We've been particularly involved in it here because there's a high degree of drug trafficking in West Virginia of all types and all over the state. So you're as busy as anybody is.
Yes.
Your territory to cover, whether you're in the Northern or the Southern District, is huge. And your attorneys have to travel to Martinsburg,
right,
to Wheeling, Clarksburg, Elkins.
Right. And then the detention centers that the U.S. Marshals use in a 3-state area. So we're on the road a lot.
If you want to go visit your client who's in a detention center, from your office in Clarksburg, you have a 2-hour drive to Moundsville.
Right.
You have about an hour's drive to Doddridge County.
Right. The Marshals also use holding facilities in Marietta, Ohio, and Youngstown, Ohio. So
I've had to make the trip to Marietta a couple of times. I've had to make the trip to Youngstown several times.
Right, right.
And you're just sitting in a car, burning time, money, and gasoline.
It's a trade-off. We're paying an attorney $125 to travel to a distant detention center. So one side is spending money. The other side perhaps will be saving some money because it's slightly less expensive to keep that person in that detention center versus one much closer to the courthouse. So it's a trade-off.
More importantly, though, as a prosecutor, if you want to talk to the people involved in your case, you call them and say, come to my office.
Right.
As a defense attorney, you might get to do that, but you're also dealing with a group of people who are difficult clients as a defense attorney.
Sure.
These are people who have difficulty understanding sometimes, people who are limited in their ability.
And since they're the most serious federal criminal cases, a large percentage of the clients for both our office and the private attorneys are being held in custody while the case is pending. So you don't have the luxury of calling the person up and asking that he or she just come into your office. You're going to a detention center or a regional jail to meet and have a meaningful dialogue.
The prosecutor's witnesses who are not police officials are usually confidential informants, and they can call them and say, as a condition of your being treated well, you've got to come to my office. If we want to find witnesses on behalf of our clients, we have to go out and figuratively beat the bushes to find them and then try to convince them to work with us.
Correct, correct.
Well, maybe it'll get better next year. What we need to do is get some congressmen involved in it and seeing that their rights are affected so that maybe they will go and pass a bill to make it easier for us to get on that airplane.
I agree, sir.
We like to believe that here in the United States we have the finest justice system in the world. Most of us who work in it do, in fact, believe that. It's not perfect, but it's a good system, and pretty much it works, I think we could say. But it is being endangered with this sequester business. So when you want to talk about that, remember, these are your rights under the United States Constitution. Brian, thank you very much for coming back.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you also for being with us. On behalf of the Law Works, I'm Dan Ringer. Good evening. If you would like to suggest a topic for a future The Law Works show, or if you're a school teacher and would like to receive a DVD of this show for classroom use, send us an email to thelawworks@comcast.net or visit us on Facebook. On the LawWorks website at thelawworks.org, you'll find a listing of recent The Law Works programs, additional information about this show's topic, and video of this and recent shows. You can also find the Law Works programs on YouTube and iTunes.
The Law Works is produced in cooperation with the Office of the West Virginia Attorney General, the West Virginia Bar Foundation, the Mountain State Bar, the Monongalia County Bar Association, and the West Virginia University College of Law. The Law Works is made possible by major grants from the Office of the West Virginia Attorney General and from Software Systems Incorporated, a West Virginia company established in 1975 which provides high-end support services, programming, and consulting for county government AS400 mid-range computer systems as well as PC-based systems, and by a grant from the West Virginia Bar Foundation. The West Virginia Bar Foundation, the philanthropic organization for West Virginia's legal profession and justice system, promoting public knowledge of the law in West Virginia. Additional support for the Law Works is provided by the West Virginia Supreme Court of Appeals.
From West Virginia Public Broadcasting.